Hey, Steve here. Thanks for joining me on the Sunday Stoic podcast. We're going to interview Kai Whiting today about a new paper that he wrote really for the benefit of the United Nations. It focuses on these two parallel philosophies, one Freirean educational philosophy and Stoicism, and how one could benefit the other and ways that one could kind of permeate the other. And apparently, the United Nations uses this Freirean model quite a bit, and he's trying to add Stoicism into that to kind of correct some of the issues he sees with Freirean philosophy. But also, we could argue that we need to maybe watch Stoicism a bit and make sure we don't fall into any patterns, such as in the Roman days when, rather than banishing slavery, they taught how to live with it, how to be a good slave, or how to accept your fate. Well, maybe there are certain conditions which we should not tolerate if possible and try to overcome. So ways to view those balance those two worldviews in some way, and Kai can say it more eloquently than I can. So read the paper and check out the podcast. Now, as usual, when I talk with Kai, we never go from A to B to Z. We go from A to B to R to Q, back to A, and then to Z. So I hope you can hang with us and enjoy our conversation.
Wisdom,
Thanks for joining the podcast.
justice,
Justitia,
temperance,
temperantia,
courage.
fortitudo.
Applying ancient philosophy to modern life. This is the Sunday Stoic.
Today we are joined by Kai Whiting, who's appeared on the show more than any other guest at this point. Kai, how are you doing?
I'm really good, and I'm just glad that I get that title. The most annoying Stoic ever. Who invites himself onto the show. Yeah.
That's right. Like, hey, I want to be on your show next week. What are you doing? Yeah, no. Kai, what have you been up to? You have actually been busy, so it's worth having you on the show. You're not just showing up to chew the fat. You have a paper out, don't you?
I do. We have a new paper out about sustainable education and how that links into two concepts. One is Stoicism, as we are on the Stoic podcast, but another one is Freirean education, which is what the United Nations uses when they assess their global citizenship and global education for global citizenship initiative. So they had to kind of put in both of those concepts because I wanted to link in Stoicism rather than go up to the UN, knock on their door and say, you should use Stoicism. It's always better to try to understand the other person's point of view and say, well, I think that Stoicism has something to offer here. And it was kind of saying, can we put Stoicism in policy? Or is it literally a philosophy that we can talk about and write books about and have really interesting or uninteresting conversations on Facebook? Or can it be something meaningful? So having those conversations was very interesting because I started to understand a different way of looking at the world, a different way of using language, and sometimes possibly some of the problems that UN encounters when trying to show other, say, the general public what they're trying to do, because even I spent weeks trying to understand what they were trying to tell me. And the confusions and complications of having an Hegelian Marxist framework right at the top of the UN. So quite interesting.
Some people might not be surprised by that, but others probably are. Can you tell me what is the UN Global Education First Initiative?
Well, it's the idea that everyone should have access to education, and it shouldn't be an education that is a white middle class man's view of the world. So when you and I talk about education, in our heads, we probably have the British system or the American system, and those systems are tied to values. So what we consider to be knowledge is not necessarily what the rest of the world considers to be knowledge. So to take an easy example, if you look at Islamic nations or predominantly Islamic nations, what they seem to see as true in the scientific sense is not necessarily what a Christian would see as true in the scientific sense, right? So it's about trying to understand that there are different societies. We tend to look at one society and one set of ideas and then say, but does that really engage everybody across the globe? And more importantly, does it give everyone a voice? Are they able to participate as citizens? Or are their ideas and typically language, so the indigenous communities, are their language kind of sidetracked or sidelined? And do we come with our ideas and our history, our narratives, and feed it into them rather than allowing them to speak and say, actually, your view of, say, how the US was colonized isn't quite the view that we see. And so
Right.
when you take it to a modern issue of social injustice or social conflict, people would say, well, these indigenous people are quote unquote lazy, or they don't want to be integrated into society. And they would say, but you're not integrating me into your society, you're forcing your society upon me. And that is done from an early age, so the age of 4, the age of 5, in the stories that you tell the children, in the myths that you like to explain, in the language that you use. So, for example, we have a social economic system which says that we would like to trade goods and services for $1, and say an indigenous community might say, well, that doesn't really link into what I value. That isn't what I understand as knowledge. That isn't what I understand as a way of communicating, because trade is a way of communicating and sharing. And so it's about reevaluating that and understanding that that is a process between a student and a teacher. So it's not just a top-down approach of going, okay, I'm the teacher, which I am, and Zoe used Steve, and saying what are my ideas and why my ideas work. It's also about saying, okay, what is your idea? Give me what's coming up from your perspective, and then meeting some point. I wouldn't say right in the middle, but somewhere where there's some engagement. So it's like quite Socratic in that sense, that it's like a dialogue between two sets or two different individuals where the teacher and the student learns. So the initiative is really that, to say, what does education mean? What is knowledge? Is there only one set of knowledge? Is there only one set of communities? Or what community? Like the global community, we use that word a lot in sustainability. And that's not really true in the sense that the way that I, as a British male, think about it. So that's what it's trying to do, to encourage participation, dialogue.
Okay. And is that where that Freirean idea is integrated throughout? I know we don't want to go down a long rabbit hole of discussing that, as we said before the show, but could you? So my reading the paper without a background in all of this, I see these two different things running parallel here and maybe being interwoven. So you have Stoicism, which is using a system of values and teaching a system of values to live a good life. But we know that in order, we could bring up that it has some weaknesses perhaps, or things, flaws have arisen. Like I have a quote here from your paper. Importantly, whilst a virtue-driven education may be considered a prerequisite to thoughts and acts oriented to social justice, it does not follow that practicing virtue on an individual level leads inevitably to sustainable development, any more than it led directly to the abolition of slavery.
Exactly.
So
there's a lot of questions in there. Which question did
there's
you
a lot
get?
in there. I know. I'm just thinking of this almost like an abstract of questions here, but
in a nutshell, that's exactly what it's saying. Like, we as Stoics would say, virtue is sufficient. Okay. So if it's sufficient, why did we have slavery?
Right.
Right? Because if it's sufficient, we should all know. We should all know, really have knowledge, not just some kind of idea of this concept, that slavery is unjust. So that's Julia Annis, actually. Julia Annis is a really good helped me to really understand that we can strive for virtue all we like as individuals, but when it comes to the collective, we fall down the hole sometimes, because Stoicism hasn't been readily applied, I would say, at least in the Roman period, to societal issues. So Freireans would say, that there's oppression, that when this happens, slavery is a form. They would say slavery is a form of oppression, which a Stoic wouldn't say. You wouldn't say that slavery is a form of oppression, because then you say, then my happiness is contingent on other people's actions, right? We would say that slavery is unjust and is in complete contradiction to virtue. Now, Marcus Aurelius would say, well, it's the way we treat our slave that shows us whether we're virtuous or not. And I don't think as a modern Stoic you can have that argument. But that was one.
Yeah. Obviously, it would be silly of us to take on Roman values as our own 2,000 years later, but we have been influenced by other ways of thinking. I just read some Seneca the other day where he said, um, look how hard some people have had it. Like Plato only had 3 slaves, and Zeno had no slaves, and yet no one would say they were wretched. And it's like, well, I'm glad at least Zeno had none, right? But it's a different way of viewing things that it is hard to put yourself into their sandals, I guess you could say.
Yes. So in Stoicism, you have like the dichotomy of control. So Freudians would argue, or did argue with me, that the way that we use in public, at least, the dichotomy of control, isn't really helpful sometimes. So you say, well, I can't control how sweatshops, modern slavery, are run. So therefore, there's nothing I can do. I can just reduce my amount of clothing, but I can't stop modern slavery, or I can't stop the slavery or almost slavery that is happening in, say, Amazon, when people can't even urinate properly. They have to urinate in cans, which is something that was identified in the US. So you would put your hands up and go, well, beyond my control. And so it's kind of like saying, well, is it really beyond your control? And that's the problem when you don't acknowledge, at least to some extent, that there are structures. And those structures, such as education, provide ideas. And that those ideas either help you progress or do not help you progress towards virtue. So Freudians would say those structures, in them lies the ability to have and abuse power. And that power then is used to oppress somebody, whether they realize it or not. And we are both the oppressor and the oppressed. So when we kind of walk into an education system, we accept things that are happening, we turn into the oppressor, right? Because we're silent in the treatment towards, say, the indigenous community I spoke about earlier, or the modern slave living in Bangladesh. The minute we sit there and say, well, it's beyond my control, there's nothing I can do, if we're not careful, we cross a line and start to say, well, I'm just in my action, but I know other injustices occur, but they're not oppressed because their happiness is not dependent on other people, which is a very unstoic thing to say, because you should only really talk about your own happiness and not start dictating that other people should be happy under a set number of conditions. So Freudians will say that you misunderstood the nature of society the minute you ignore the power of institutions to form ideas in your mind, particularly as children, because you're not a blank slate, but you are impressionable, right?
Sure.
As your teacher, you know that you'll get an 18-year-old who has a very strange worldview, and then you ask them about their parents, you go, yes.
That's where that
I
came
know
from.
where that came from. Yeah.
Yeah, I've had that experience from time to time. Sure. Now your paper brings up what do you call it? Eco-pedagogy?
Yes.
And would you unpack that for me?
So,
it's just teaching. Oh, go ahead.
So eco-pedagogy is looking at sustainability in the environment. Typically, the environment, we don't pay for the environment, for example. When we do an economic transaction, it's an externality. Carbon emissions. And sometimes we might get a carbon tax, but generally speaking, we don't. We ignore nature. Well, in Stoicism, we are actually called to live according to nature. Now, that's a different paper for a different day, but you could question whether, if we just live according to facts, whether we really encompass the idea of living according to nature. Now, I would say that nature provides the facts, but by removing the statement live according to nature, you kind of start to ignore the fact you are in nature, and that we don't need an Earth Day to realize that. So it's about looking at the impression. Ecopedagogy is looking at what Freudians would call the oppression, and I would call, say, the vicious actions or thoughts that we have towards the environment, where we start to say that all our values are linked to our preferences and human psychology, which is kind of what Becker says when he says we should live according to facts, and the facts are stated by social norms and human values and human preferences. And my kickback to that is, what happens if we have a preference then that makes the environment an externality? What happens if we have a preference for growth, right? Now, that is
Okay.
a fact. We have a preference for growth. Now, the fact is we can't
Yeah,
grow
we do,
infinitely,
don't
but
we?
we do have a preference for it.
I've noticed that even where I work, where if the number of students enrolled goes down, then all these plans we had get thrown out the window because everything is based on growth rather than maintaining what we have, or no one's budgeted for a decline in enrollment, for example. And that's just in a small university scale, but we always hear about growth, and then what you might call an oxymoron, sustainable growth. I think you talk about a bit in your paper, um, and and uh, and why is it that we're so focused on growth?
Because our economic models are graphs, and they say images, isn't it? Images state 1,000 words or something like that. And so, if you believe from the age of 18 that growth is infinite, and everything around you is like it's built to support this growth idea, then, like you say, things fall apart when you can't get the amount of students. So then they start cutting staff, right? Which I would say is a very unsustainable thing to do,
Right.
because they don't start cutting the buildings because they think staff are easier to get rid of, right? So you start to have these casualties going on. Now, those casualties tend to be workers in a general labor context, but outside of workers, the bottom line always tends to be, we can pollute the environment. We can mine. We just need to keep the system going. We need to keep extracting metals and minerals, and then we can eventually, get enough growth to stop the environmental problems. There are people who will state openly that growth is the way forward if we want to solve the environmental problem. To which point I kind of be like, growth is what caused the environmental problem. So why would growth suddenly turn around and solve it? So in ecopedagogy, it's like understanding the role of the environment in supporting everything that we do, and giving some kind of, I wouldn't say worship, but some kind of reverence. I don't necessarily mean a spiritual reverence, but some kind of appreciation for the fact that we are reliant on those resources, and they are
Sure.
not infinite. The problem is when you model your whole, you go to school and you want to get a job, typically you don't think about nature, you think about career advancement. And if you don't take a moment to reflect, even if you're Stoic, you get caught up in ideas that don't really match with what nature is offering or what is available to us. So climate change is a very good example. You say, well, I need to get to work, I live in the US, or I'll go and buy a car. And I'll buy the biggest car possible because I get a tax break, or because I get a bonus, because in America I need a big car. And then you start to think about your carbon emissions, and you say, oh, but I need that car, and if I don't have a car, then I can't get my son to school. And you start to build in these mechanisms to avoid you looking at the fact that nature is being eroded away, or even social relationships are being eroded away, or more sustainable economic systems, which I would say are probably degrowth, looking at where we need to grow in terms of, say, social justice, and looking at, say, the 1% and going, like in Davos, did you really need the 1,200 planes to fly here? You're talking about climate change, but you're not actually doing anything about it. You're saying that we should solve the problem, but you're actually contributing to it. And I saw a really good example. It was an American advert, and it was like for insurance, and they say, taking care of you and taking care of the planet. And she recycles a glass bowl. She then goes into a coffee shop and she uses a single-use cup. And that's American.
It's like eating having the Diet Coke.
Exactly. Exactly, and that's it. Or when they say, like, oh, we need to build more. If you want to solve the climate change problem, I think it's quite simple: plant more trees. So they'll plant more trees, and then they go, oh, but we need a bigger lane in the Los Angeles, highway. You're like, didn't you just build more trees? Didn't you just plant more trees? And they're like, yes, and we can now, therefore, because we need more.
We offset this, right?
We offset this, and it's ecopedagogy is saying, well, what values are you teaching people? Like, where are you getting this idea that you can just, the fat man's getting less fat by, giving himself a bigger belt? Oh, look, I lost weight, I have a bigger belt. And it's like looking and re-examining your view. Re-examining what you teach and what you learn and why you do it.
I was trying to picture this in a graphic almost. So you have your graphic that you've used before, where you have self and community, and expanding out. And in your case, you've added the environment or the biosphere. We almost need to go 3D on that and have temporal justice. Don't you like we can't go in the past. That's an indifferent essentially, but we can. What we do now literally affects 3 generations from now.
Yes,
um,
or
and
more.
we could easily, well, yeah, and so it's a form of justice, I guess. I just call it like temporal justice, like the future generations that we're impacting when we only focus on our own small sphere. That's
Absolutely. Because that tells you something about your values. You're saying I'm more important than my children or other people's children, right? Or my steak is the taste of my steak is more important. And we spoke about this before. So ecopedagogy was like going one step back and going, why do I think this? Where are these ideas coming from? Like reminding myself that my ideas are formed. You and I are both very fortunate that our ideologies, economically speaking, are what the entire globe tends to use these days. If we'd gone back 300 years, things would be very different. So when you see injustice, sometimes you can ask the question, okay, what is it that the system is producing? Why is it producing that? What are the underlying mechanisms that people are being taught to continue this injustice? Why are we allowing that to continue? What, so say taking slavery, what value, when I enslave somebody, what am I saying? And why do I think that having a few more hours or the ability to earn more or more money is more important? So in Davos, literally like yesterday, they were saying that, oh, more employment is the option, is the goal. So if you tax the wealthy, you're actually stopping people getting into meaningful employment. In which case they said, well, farms in the US, that's not very meaningful. And providing money, like giving away to charity, is still giving you a choice as a wealthy billionaire. You're not actually necessarily providing money where the needs human needs should be met. You're providing them for your pet projects.
right.
So there's the question of like, where does the idea of I shouldn't be taxed come from? Or where does the idea that I'm responsible for everything that I have, and which is, I think you quite libertarianism over there, right? Like I'm
Right.
responsible for everything that I have, and I shouldn't have to pay for other people's education, or I shouldn't have to pay for other people's health. And then
Well,
you say,
you
well,
get the idea. Some people have the idea, like, I like to I don't know, I use nature analogies here. So like a tree that has outgrown all the other trees and it's above the forest and it's big and tall and above everyone and thinks that it doesn't need anyone else. It's not dependent on anything else. It grew this big all on its own, forgetting where its roots are. Its roots
yes,
are down there, intertwined with everybody else's, and using some of their water and resources to get that big. But we can easily forget about that and just think about how much we deserve something when in fact maybe that's a misnomer. And you see that quite a bit, I think.
yeah, I think the idea that's an excellent idea because the bigger the tree, the more water it would need actually. And there is a good example of people often point the finger at poor people for not doing their part. But if you're very wealthy and you say have a private jet, do you know how many people you need to operate? Who's taxing who was the question. That was really interesting. So I wanted to just go to that step back and just question like where I've got my ideas from, and why do we teach children things? Why, for example, why do we teach them that recycling is an environmentally friendly thing to do when most of that plastic ends up in the stomachs of whales and other marine life? And you're a biologist, so I'm sure you know more than I do about the subject. Why do we not question when you're 5 years old and continue to question why growth is the way forward, or why it's okay to have one ideology or one political cause, or one system which favors a certain set group of people instead of the cosmopolitan whole. So that was like the where it came from, like to go deeper, and then you
Mhm.
really think, okay, because education is the next generation. So the next generation ideas means that we're going to continue in the same direction, which is the problem with education. I would say that it's quite reactive and not proactive. I don't know if
Mhm.
you've got an example of that, where actually a more proactive stance would have been much more helpful, say 10 years ago, than trying to put out a fire.
Sure. When you look at um, the way that certain populations struggle, like first generation college students, their parents have never gone to college. Now they're in college, and they fail at a higher rate than students that have come from families that have gone to college. And we didn't think about that ahead of time and have a program in place to get them ready. We see them failing and then try to fix it after the fact. And that happens with all kinds of issues, but that's just one that comes to mind because I'm on a committee trying to figure out ways to improve the drop fail rate, for example. How to keep students keep them in school, and not just in school and failing, but allowing them to succeed without lowering the bar. What do we have to do to get them there? And we usually don't think about that until we
They're
see
already
a
failing.
massive problem. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
So how would like Stoic principles help you navigate that problem?
Well, first of all, you have to care enough to worry about it, and not just from a, I mean, the school cares. You could argue that an institution cares because of financial reasons, right? But as an instructor, if you don't have some sense of justice, you're probably not going to get up and go to school every day. I don't know. For my end, I care about student learning, right? It's why I get up and do it. So having a sense of justice gets me in there. But Stoicism has a lot of it runs parallel with scientific thinking in many ways, even though modern science wasn't a thing when Stoicism originally originated. It was kind of in its infancy then. But these ideas of okay, we have a social problem, and then maybe we can apply our knowledge of kind of hypothesis testing to fix it, and but we want to improve this social issue, and we want to personally, it's just heartbreaking to have a group of students in your class, and no matter how you teach, and then you give them a test, and then they do poorly, and just to say bye, see ya, it's kind of feels cold and unjust to do that. If there's something else you can do, it's worth pursuing.
So to ask like a eco-pedagogy question from a prayer perspective, is that why do you think something is unjust? That's that question they would ask me, like, okay, so where does your notion of injustice come from? And
Hmm.
say you and I are both on the committee and we have different views of what justice, because I don't think it's fair that, for example, I might not think it's fair that we give our students another chance, right? And
Right.
I've been in meetings where they think that's not fair. So
Sure.
as a Stoic, how do we navigate that?
Well, part of it is, if you listen to someone like Marcus Aurelius, it's to nudge the other person towards what you believe to be true. Of course, we all know how that works in academia sometimes. Everyone thinks they
Yeah.
know what's true, and they'll just yell louder at each other. Um, but the my concern is a lot of times when you have those disagreements, you just have death by committee, and not much actually is resolved. So um, I guess it depends where the injustice lies. Here, it's a lot of times the injustice is before they get to university level.
Yes.
It's the education that got them here is vastly different depending on where you lived and where you went to school, and trying to find ways to combat that once you're all funneled into the university now, and now you're all here, and obviously just saying, okay, here's the textbook, here's the lecture, here's the test. Not
Yes.
everyone's able to meet that bar, and trying to work that out is very difficult.
I think that's the nail on the head. Like just within the US, for example, that you have different, say, postcode or zip code. I think you call them over there, zip code lotteries. Just where you happen to be born, which is of no fault of your own, or happen to live, and the family that you come from, and you arrive at an institution, and in theory, everybody has the same level of education, or at least the same type of education. And then through no fault of their own, people fall through. I mean, obviously there are people that are lazy, but we're not talking about those. But the people
Right.
that really make the effort and want to be there, and they fall through the hole, and they fail, and they go into that cycle where they don't think they can achieve, and then they give up, and then it does become, self-fulfilling prophecy. They become, say, quote unquote, lazy because they don't see the point of trying anyway. I think as Stoics, it's the question, okay, where does this injustice come from? So, for example, you might find that this kid came from a very difficult school, and for that person to have achieved, to even have got here, he or she had to work much harder than the cream of the crop.
Right.
And that's not always the case, but that could be the case. And so I think they to try to take that step back and go, okay, what are the values of, say, this institution, say your university over there, or this department, because normally it's a department decision in the first place, and say, what do we want to say? Do we want just people coming up with the best grades, or we want to say that we are, a community department, that we care about our students, that we want them to achieve, that we're aware that we're all human and we have our weaknesses and strengths, and we want to, as iron sharp as iron, to use a biblical phrase, but where do you draw the line? I think was the most challenging aspect of, like, where do you start looking at the problem? Where do you start thinking about the big concepts of what freedom entails, like the freedom to be educated, and what does that mean?
As a professor applying Stoicism, I don't have the power to change. Well, especially I could have influence of temporal justice over what the schools do in the future, maybe, if I rallied and worked and got on school boards, but I can't change the education experience of the student I have in my class right now.
Yes, that's the unique change of education.
That's fixed in place. So now I have to do something now with that student that gives them the best chance, to succeed if possible. And then when you have 400 students or something, it's you can't tailor it to one individual necessarily. So then trying to figure out a program to put in place that can help many students, and what that would look like and where the weak spots are. That takes a lot of thought. It takes a lot of research. It takes a lot of wrong turns and failures to find something that really works. And what I'm trying to do in my own classroom is I am using technology, but I'm using it in a different way. So it's more like a chalkboard. I'm writing more myself to get rid of text going by at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And I'm making students get in groups and discuss more, and then work on things together in groups. And I give assessments to students the first day, and I pair up students that did really well with those that struggled into groups, so that way they can watch each other and model each other's behavior or learn from each other, and they work on activities in those groups in my lecture. Instead of me just standing there talking like the god of biology up front, I have them work on things as much as possible, and that's something I'm trying to counteract some of those issues I've seen.
I think that's a good example of how eco-pedagogy would work, or pedagogy in general. Like, okay, I'm not going to just stand here and be the fountain of all knowledge. And so eco-pedagogy is saying to people, why? I've done this before in my classrooms. Like, what took people outside? They're like, why are we going outside? I'm like, we're learning about the environment. Why would I stand here and tell you about how green spaces in urban areas, for example, are very helpful to people's well-being? We've got to go out there and, maybe not the Stoic concept of well-being, but certainly the generic sense of well-being.
Right.
And I took them outside in the middle of Bogota in Colombia and go, look, isn't it better to learn outside? Don't you connect more? And I think that's part of the education, that because we often think that everything comes down to human preferences or human emotions or human psychology. If we're in the classroom, that's really easy to sort of put in your head. You try saying that in the middle of a cornfield, or the middle of a park, or the middle of a beautiful, not in the middle of the river, but maybe next to the riverbed, and say, look, is this all it is? Is human preferences, or is there something out to engage the student with something more than systems? Which is why I would say things like economics work so well, because you don't need to show them, if you went and took them to sweatshops, if you went and took people to landfill, which is where most of the goods in inverted commas, and that speech, goods end up. If I were to take these people to landfill or wastewater treatments and things that you should do is to instruct. Say, really, is this the economic system that fills you with joy? Yeah, you might see on the blackboard and chalk that we have infinite growth. Is that the case when you look at all around you? When you go to what used to be, say, an Indonesian rainforest, or even a US national park with sort of litter overflowing the last couple of weeks, is this really what life is about? So I think eco-pedagogy, or pedagogy in general, critical pedagogy, is challenging the norms and values so that they don't become the institutionalized means to, say, for example, be racist or support an economic system which it requires waste. We require waste. It's a throwaway culture. I'm like, where? And I think you've heard me say it before, but where is away? Where are you throwing it? Where is away?
Right, it's going
there is
away.
No away. Yeah. So even language, like for example, we tend to use. I don't know if you use do you use the word fish stock rather than fish population?
I guess I would say the only time I've used the word stock and fish together is when I was working at a fish hatchery and I had to go stock a lake with fish.
That's different. But we do say livestock, right?
But livestock, yeah, we do, yeah. I don't say fish. I don't think of, I haven't used the word fish stock in that sense. No.
Yeah. So when you look at even language, so you say livestock, what does that say? That cows have no intrinsic value, right?
They're a living food unit.
Yeah, exactly. So in Stoicism, cows do not have intrinsic value, but nor do human beings. The only thing that has intrinsic value is logos, the essence of nature itself. So when you're called to live, that's one argument that I made at Stoicon. Like if you stood up and said, well, if you stop a cow from living according to their nature, how can you stand up and say that you live according to nature, but you withdraw that ability for other human beings and animals, or even nature itself? You're really saying you live according to nature. That's why I think saying living according to facts can be a little bit. I start to get a little bit like, oh, we're going to live according to facts, but what do facts mean? And there are obviously objective facts. Climate change is happening. That is a fact. Mm-hmm. And a lot of you're going to get hate mail now, but
so is evolution. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, we're going to get all those. Okay, there's a fact that climate change is happening, but climate change is a normative fact. So, for example, you might say, why is climate change bad? And then people will generally say to you, oh, because the sea rises are occurring. Why is that bad? Oh, because people's livelihoods are being flooded. So climate change is bad for you.
Right.
And if you're American, you might say, it's not bad for me because I don't live anywhere near the sea and I don't know anything about this climate change. And you might say, okay, go to the Pacific Islands and ask them how far was the sea from this beach 25 years ago. In Greenland, they want climate change because they think that they would be able to develop and grow their economy, right? Which in Greenland, I would argue that probably growing the economy would probably be a good thing for that particular economy because it does need some kind of injection. So then you start to say, well, who decides whether climate change is good or bad? I mean, you can't say climate change is virtuous or vicious. You can say not preventing climate change in line with the core of living according to nature and living according to facts. You can say that, but you can't say climate change per se is bad or good. Climate change is change.
Indifferent, I guess, right?
It's indifferent, yeah. It's indifferent. I mean, that's why they started to use the word climate breakdown, which when you start to say climate breakdown, that ceases to say it's indifferent is a little bit more difficult to do.
Right.
But that's why I said, slavery per se isn't good or bad. You have to understand what you mean, because you'd say, okay, I personally, I think that treating animals the way we do in mass production is a form of slavery. A lot of people say that it's not. And so I'm like, well, what does slavery entail? Or you're not able to live according to how you want to live. You're not able to freely move. You're owned by somebody. So aren't they really modern day slaves too? couldn't you even argue that certain bosses make you a modern day slave because you can't, for 10 hours a week you can't leave? Like where do you start to say that slavery is bad? And then you have to understand the mechanisms behind it. You have to really dig deeper, because there are no facts to say slavery is bad. You say, okay, slavery is bad because, oh, people are dying, but in Stoicism, death isn't bad. Death is indifferent. Oh, but then people are they're suffering pain, but in Stoicism, pain isn't bad. Pain,
but you could argue that
go,
you inflicting pain
yes,
is bad.
yes, of course,
Right?
yeah, of course. So you have to start, but that's not a fact. Like that's
Right.
not. I can't show you on
A chart.
some kind of chart like how much pain is bad for you to inflict. So that's the challenge of Stoicism.
So
That
is
it requires you to go
that
beyond.
is that how these two systems can help each other in some way? These Freirian system of thinking and Stoicism, because you have both of them running through this paper.
Yeah.
Do you see them as supporting each other somehow with this kind of discussion?
Well, I think the main support is that they believe that the eco side of Freudians, because there are Freudians that don't do eco stuff.
Yeah.
They'll say that we should be biocentric, so that we should see the world through the world's eyes, right? Which in Stoicism, and for a lot of people, doesn't make sense, because I can't see the world through a woman's eyes. Like, I can say that I really, I want to understand the gender pay gap and I feel something for women, but to say that I can see the world through a black woman's eyes would be a lie. It
Right.
would be a very callous lie, right? So that's somebody of my own species. It could even be, my friend or a wife or my mom. Like it could be something, I still can't see the world through a woman's eyes. To see the world through the earth's eyes is something that to me makes no sense. It's incoherent. So I argued the case with them that, well, Hegel says people say, oh, you should think for yourself. Well, who else can you think for? So he says you can't think for somebody else any more than you can drink or eat for him. Mm-hmm. So to say, well, I don't think having a biocentric viewpoint is coherent, because you're still basically what you're trying to do is empathize a little bit more with the environment, which in Stoicism you can do for a logocentric lens. You can say, okay, because I have the logos, which is the essence of nature, the rational essence of nature in me, I can do that. But I'm not stopping myself from being human, because being biocentric means you're not anthropocentric. And as a Stoic, I said to them, well, what else could you be? And so philosophically, they get a lot of criticism because of this biocentric idea. So it's like saying to them, but is that really consistent? Or are we trying to be anthropocentric in terms of how we see things, but thinking about how we can be more just, how we can act with self-control, how we can be a little bit more wise, how this would take courage? Because virtue in the end is one thing, and if there is a situation where I need to be strong and secure in my decision, that might be manifested as courage. If I need to make a good decision and understand what makes that decision good, virtue is made manifest as wisdom. So it's not like we have, like, say, 4 virtues and they're completely separable. I would say they're like 4 manifestations of the word virtue, depending on what's being called of you. So it's to talk to them about that, to show them that actually, if you act with justice, you don't need to come from a biocentric point of view. You just have to understand that as a human being, you have an influence, a huge influence compared to any other animal on this planet. Or even now, weather conditions, we start to call it the Anthropocene. We have such an impact that every single decision that we make needs to be well thought out, either by ourselves or in a collective sense, because we can't know everything, but we should know where we could go if we wanted to know whether, say, climate change was real. We might check the NASA website. So to understand where we can activate knowledge, where we can really incorporate information and do something about it. So it's tried to help them be more philosophically, coherent and consistent, and to argue with them, is there such thing as oppression? Does that mean somebody else's controls your life? Because in Stoicism, you can only oppress yourself. You
Right.
you only become oppressed if you believe you are oppressed.
Sure.
So your happiness is only dependent on what you do, unless I would say like you were say in a coma or something where you really couldn't express any form of agency.
Right. Right. Like James Stockdale being captured and legs broken and put into a prisoner of war camp, and chooses to focus on his very limited power of choice and focus on that in order to because if you focus on everything else that's happening to you that you can't control,
Yes,
there's no form of happiness available to you if that's what you're focusing on, I
exactly.
guess.
So it's to
But
say that we can, if we have agency, we can, as long as we have agency, we can do that. We can make decisions. And their point of view was yes, but if you ignore structures, then you're actually ignoring a huge aspect of how your agency functions in reality. And I said, yes, that's true. You know, you can't ignore how education shaped you and say, well, it's, you know, that can't be of control. I'm in control of that. Yes, you are, but there are some aspects that you may not be aware of that you need to re-envision so that you can take a better scope of agency, that you can make better decisions. So it's kind of like comparing and contrasting, taking notes, but questioning, because they talk about utopia. They'll say
right,
the ability to question, the ability to obtain a utopia is something real and necessary so that you can suddenly realize that you've been oppressed this whole time. And we don't really in Stoicism have a view of utopia because
right,
we say everybody can, you could achieve it now. We don't need a specific state or a specific set of conditions for ourselves personally outside of the four virtues. And we are in control as long as we have agency to deliver those virtues, right? So we don't have this
right.
kind of, we don't have a form of utopia. So it was kind of interesting to say, well, why would you need a utopia?
Unless it's Zeno's Republic, which we don't even have a copy of, which it was kind of an interesting kind of city of no laws and no temples and all sages hanging out and sleeping with each other.
Well, yeah, I guess, yeah, the only form of utopia that we have is so you're correct. So I should correct myself on that. So yes, if we all become sages, that would be a utopia. But the ability to become a sage, which I would say Freund would see as a utopia, is not dependent on anything else. But you being able to express agency and then progressing in virtue.
An odd side note. I was reading something in your paper about sustainability and sagehood, and they were both mentioned in proximity to each other. And I was trying to think if sustainability is like sagehood. You know, in Stoicism, we make progress, but you're not a sage until you're a sage, right? Like,
Yes.
and like you're not sustainable until you are sustainable. Like,
Correct.
you're not
And
there
and
until
you
you're
and you
there.
can't decide yourself whether you're being sustainable or not. Someone else would have to tell you, right? They would have to be able to say that man lives a very sustainable life. I can if I have to jump up and down and go, well, I am being very sustainable, then I would question whether I actually were. I do think sustainable development does really map onto what a sage is because, as you rightly said earlier on, you can't have sustainable development in injustice.
Mhm.
You can't. You just can't. You can't act with greed and have sustainable development because greed, by definition, can't be sustained.
Right.
And ignorance is not going to lead to sustainable development because you're not going to know what to do and when to do it. And that's something that I highlighted in Stoicon, and I think it has everything to do with it. And that's the challenge, I think, of 21st century Stoicism is to go beyond how I feel if I feel angry and go, okay, if I can control my anger, I can understand that it's just an impression, a false cognitive impression. Okay, I'm just angry, and what am I really angry about? But when it gets to societal issues and it goes to how do we deal with these children that are failing, I think Stoicism has to engage with the reality that it is up to me how I behave, but how
Right.
society operates isn't only up to me. And so I have to understand that there are structures in place, there are mechanisms that prevent people from achieving. I would say there is a glass ceiling for women and a glass ceiling for indigenous community, and I've been attacked on Facebook for that, saying, well, it's a dichotomy of control. They obviously they have the control to get past that glass ceiling. Well, how would you know? You're a white man, you're standing on it. But I would say that's not Stoicism. Stoicism is the ability to process what's happening to you via the glass ceiling and to understand what you make of it and say that is not going to affect my happiness, but it is going to affect your job prospect. Like there's no way.
Right. It's
There's
going to have
nothing.
you can't self-control yourself out of reality. You still have to live in it, but how you handle it and what if anything are you going to do about it
Exactly.
is a decision you have to make and then an action you have to take.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, all right. Anything else we should discuss on this important meeting, Kai?
I don't think so. I think you actually put it well. Exactly the last sentence that you just said. I think that would be an excellent way of ending the podcast.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me again, Kai. And do you have more papers in the works?
I do. So I've been working with Chris Gill and Tony Long and Leo on why we should live according to nature and why that is beneficial to the environmental ethics of Stoicism that I've been building. And William Stevens has been building for a long time, to be honest. So it's sort of saying, yes, you can live according to facts for yourself. Like you can understand what, for example, if you're not very good at maths, maybe you shouldn't be a mathematician because you don't feel harmony within yourself. Yeah. Or you can be a biologist. They tend to, you guys are really good at statistics. So, but when you talk about harmony on environmental issues, living according to facts kind of breaks down because you don't always have the facts. So things like you might not know if fracking is good or bad because you don't have facts, and you'd have to kind of you could infer them.
I live in an area where the only earthquake I've ever experienced was due probably to fracking.
There you go.
When the frackers left town, the earthquakes went away. So odd that. But anyway,
Yeah,
sorry.
that's cool. Yeah, no, but now you have the facts. So the idea is like to live according to facts. There's a kind of like a lie almost, or at least a mistruth of people who believe in the orthodox Stoicism think we shouldn't live according to facts. It's like, well, they don't. That's not the case. They would argue that the universe is good and that the universe being good because it provides everything we need is why we should have some kind of reverence towards it. That's why we should see it as being good. It's not necessarily good in any other sense. Okay. So it's like looking at how living according to nature frames our obligations, our cosmopolitan obligation towards the environment. Because as I said before, like rejecting the claim of living according to nature, for me sits very uncomfortably because then I forget that I live that I live in nature and I'm educated in a way that should envision natural processes and doesn't. So I'll be back on for that.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm trying to build in sort of an environmental ethics framework, but it's not easy and it takes a lot of collaboration from a lot of different people because I don't have all the questions I need to get the answers.
Well, I'm glad you're pushing forward, and I'm sure you'll ruffle some feathers along the way. But how was Stoicon, by the way? I saw your talk there. I wasn't there, but I watched it. Was it a good experience?
It was really interesting, and I really enjoyed it. I think everyone thought it was hilarious that I was wearing a tie or something, being probably the youngest speaker there. But I always find that if you wear a tie, people take you more seriously.
It's true. It's odd, but it's true.
It's odd. Yeah, it has nothing to do with my virtue, but people take me more seriously. I think it was just a really good opportunity to meet with people and to understand, okay, what are you doing in Stoicism, and to collaborate. So a lot of collaborations came out of that. And people saying, well, I've read your work and I want to collaborate with you. And you could actually have discussions like the paper that I've been doing with Chris, Tony, and Leo came out of a sort of a dinner and discussing like why they may be a little bit, no, I wouldn't say upset, but concerned in the same way that I am that's being, say, pushed aside when I kind of think of it as more of like a Russian doll that living according to nature necessitates, or it is necessary that we live according to facts. But living according to facts doesn't necessarily mean that we understand the implications of removing living according to nature. I understand that Massimo is never going to turn around and say, don't live according to nature, like become a economic disaster and or be a Donald Trump. I know he's not going to say that to me. But the power of language is very important. So it's like looking at how we can use this framework to support environmental harmony and sustainability.
All right. Well, Kai, thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome.
Carpe diem. All right, I'll
Thank you for
pause
listening to the Sunday
recording
Stoic.
here. Let me
If you
stop.
enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review the Sunday Stoic on iTunes. Become a member of the Sunday Stoic team, earn rewards, and be an integral part of the show by becoming a patron at www.patreon.com/SundayStoic. Contact the show by emailing sundaystoic@gmail.com or by leaving a voicemail at 501-503-3132. To find out more, visit www.sundaystoicpodcast.com. And as Steve always says, carpe diem.